Please consider supporting me on my Patreon, which is linked in the description below, to receive some great rewards. How's it going, everyone? It's me, Lone, and welcome back to Fallout: The Definitive Story, the series where we explore the main story of the original Fallout game. In the last episode, which you can find linked in the description below, we covered the entire history of Fallout's Great War. And today, we're going to be looking at what happened after the Great War and the secret of the vaults in Fallout. And to continue with our Fallout merchandise giveaways, today we're giving away a number of different things to one lucky viewer. First, we have this Nuka-Cola Quantum light up cup. Does this one light up? Please tell me it does. Oh, it actually does. Thought the batteries didn't work. We have that. We also have this Fallout pin set, and I think the piece de resistance is this Fallout 4 Vault Dweller Survival Guide. It's shining a little bit, but yes, it looks fantastic. If you want to win this entire pack, you just got to do one thing for me. So please subscribe to my channel and answer the following question. If you were placed into Fallout's world, which faction would you side with and why? I'm looking for really interesting and unique answers here. And also, please let me know what country you're from as well, just to make sure I can ship the items to you. I'll pick the winner within about 2 weeks and direct message you on YouTube. So sit back, relax, and enjoy Fallout: The Definitive Story, Part 2. Fallout's introduction tells us that, after the 2-hour Great War, most of the planet was reduced to cinders. But from the ashes of nuclear devastation, a new civilization would arise nonetheless. There were a few that managed to reach the safety of underground vaults, with the family of the protagonist, the Vault Dweller, residing safely in Vault 13, under a mountain of stone. But how exactly did we get here? How did thousands of people survive the nuclear catastrophe? Let's take a look. After all the nuclear weapons stopped dropping and the Great War ended, Fallout's world was plunged into a holocaust. Most humans on Earth were killed, whether from the actual explosions themselves or the subsequent radioactive exposure. But let's break this down a little further. Not everyone in the United States actually perished. Some tried to find protection in a variety of locations, including subways, drainage centers, and sewers. Others tried to hide in Kowalski preservation shelters, but these were simply useless in providing any real protection against the nuclear drops, let alone the subsequent fallout. However, a group of children managed to survive the war by hiding in the lamplight cabins in Washington, D.C. during a school field trip. I mention this because it truly exemplifies the fact that most of the people who survived the Great War, outside of those in the vaults, were either in places that weren't directly impacted by the bombs or in locations protected by several layers of rock and metal. And even for those who weren't in the immediate impact zone, if they did not protect themselves against the high levels of radiation produced afterwards, it was all but likely that they would either die or mutate into the many ghouls that infest the wasteland. Whereas some humans became feral ghouls that simply attack others on sight, others managed to mutate into ghouls that still maintain their human personality and abilities to both communicate and reason. The animals of the Fallout world suffered a similar fate, mutating into horribly deformed, enlarged, and dangerous creatures. Cows became two-headed Brahmin, rats became mole rats, black bears turned into Yaogwai, ants became giant ants, North America emperor scorpions turned into rat scorpions, and so on. There were also these things called super mutants, but we'll talk more about them once we cover the FEV. It was these segments of society outside the vaults that would take the initial steps of slowly rebuilding Fallout's New World Order, but it certainly wasn't easy. First and foremost, the world was plunged into darkness thanks to a nuclear electromagnetic pulse, or EMP, produced thanks to the Great War. Then, within about a week, black soot rained from the sky for 4 days, which thanks to the radiation and other contagions, sparked a nuclear fallout that would plague the world. This irradiated rain and subsequent fallout was the cause of millions of more deaths across the USA, and not simply of just humans, but also of plant and animal life. Yet, even after all of this catastrophe, thousands of humans still managed to live. These survivors started to rebuild, with small towns and settlements cropping up across the United States. having to work their way through the rubble and decimated houses, buildings, roads, and other structures. But yes, surprisingly, even given the increased levels of radiation and destruction, there were still areas in the US that were indeed habitable. Some of these groups congregated towards former cities, which contained buildings left relatively intact even after the Great War. But naturally, most larger American cities were utterly destroyed, as they were the main targets of the nuclear bomb strikes. Some examples of established cities and towns in the setting of the original Fallout game, previously Southern California but now called New California, include Junktown and the Hub. Junktown was built using wrecked cars and other junk littered across the wasteland, and the Hub, a large trading city, was founded in the year 2093 by one man, Angus, who found an old town and a desert oasis that managed to survive the Great War relatively unscathed. But as you would imagine, the post-war US was far from a safe place. Many of the remaining humans turned into vicious raiders, who would generally attack anyone on sight and both kill and steal to ensure their own survival. Others instead became organized gangs, and while they too would kill, steal, and commit other crimes, their actions were quite distinct to regular raiders and arguably model the gangs and mobs of our own world. Then there were the super mutants, mutated creatures, robots, and other machines that too would attack anyone who strayed too closely. Suffice it to say, in the years following the Great War, those on the mainland US found it incredibly difficult to both survive and rebuild, yet they somehow persevered. So then we get to the vaults. Whereas most above ground perished in nuclear fire and fallout, thousands of Americans managed to evacuate in time to the safety of over 120 underground vaults. But what were these vaults? Why were they built? What purpose did they actually serve? It's time for another deep dive. The vaults were large subterranean residences built across the United States, totaling 122 in number, although several secret vaults were built too. The US government commissioned the Vault-Tec Corporation in 2054 to design and build the vaults, with Robco Industries becoming involved later on. The entire initiative was dubbed Project Safe House, and by June 2074, the construction for all vaults had completed. Each vault could house up to 1,000 people, but as discussed in the last video, they tended to be underpopulated as many civilians at the time did not take the warning alarm seriously. Additionally, each vault was incredibly expensive to build. While the price of the US dollar in Fallout is severely inflated, Vault 13 for instance ended up costing about $645 billion. The official purpose of the vaults that was communicated to the American public was to provide protection to civilians in the event of a nuclear war. And in some instances, there were a few that did actually survive and re-emerge years later, once the severity of the nuclear fallout had settled down. In addition to the protection provided by the vaults, this was thanks to the resources, food, and other items that the vaults were also supplied with, capable of keeping inhabitants alive for decades. However, given the 400 million Americans alive at the time before the Great War, the vaults were never large enough in number to provide protection to even a small minority of the population. As we know, the US government had a far more sinister motive behind the Vault project, that being to conduct secret experiments on the pre-selected inhabitants, mostly without their knowledge. The government crafted a range of social experiments, each different in their design and execution, to analyze and determine how humans would react in response to various scenarios. The US government, later becoming known as the Enclave, then positioned Vault-Tec researchers at separate facilities to monitor and research the results. The government ultimately did this in order to determine the best way to resettle a new society on Earth, or indeed another planet, if it ended up being necessary, such as if a nuclear catastrophe occurred. Out of the 122 public vaults, only 17 of them were designed to run in a normal manner, without any experimentation. These vaults included 3, 8, and 76, and they were generally planned to open anywhere from 10 to 20 years after the Great War. Every other vault, however, was subject to a social experiment of some sort, with some being minor in nature and others being much more aggressive and cruel. Taking a look at the vaults within Fallout 1 specifically, Vault 12 was intentionally designed for the main door to not close properly, so that the effects of radiation could be studied on the inhabitants. As a result, most if not all of those in Vault 12 turned into ghouls. Vault 13's experiment was one of extended isolation, designed to remain shut for 200 years after the Great War, in order to examine how the inhabitants would react to such a long period of enclosure. Then comes Vault 15, which was subject to an arguably more minor experimentation. Inhabitants of the vault were extensively pre-selected to have very different ideologies and backgrounds in life, and were designed to stay closed for 50 years after the Great War, just to see how they would all interact and get along with one another. We'll go into more detail about the other Vault experiments in a separate lore decrypted video, but suffice it to say, most of the non-control vaults resulted in utter and complete failure, with inhabitants either dying or being driven insane. But even some of those in the non-control vaults managed to survive, in addition of course to a few of the control vaults. The inhabitants of some vaults decided to re-emerge out to the wasteland, whereas others had absolutely no intention and instead decided to remain locked in. For those that did leave, however, thanks to their technology, they began to create small towns and settlements, repopulate, and begin anew. Focusing on the first game setting again, New California, the city of Necropolis was created in 2083 by Vault 12, i.e. the Ghoul Vault, in Bakersfield. The Boneyard was started in 2092 by the LA Vault in Los Angeles. And finally, the settlement of Shady Sands was established in 2142 by Vault 15. Then you had Vault 13, where the protagonist of Fallout 1 begins. The inhabitants of this vault decided not to leave, opting instead for a life of isolation within. However, a certain problem occurred, which forced the Overseer to send out the Vault Dweller to the Wasteland in the year 2161, but that of course will be covered in the next episode. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Fallout: The Definitive Story. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe, I would really appreciate it. Also, as always, give a big thank you to the Fallout wiki run by Fandom, which is linked in the description below, as the information contained there really does help me write the scripts for these videos. So until next time, this has been the Lone Vault Wanderer. Please take care of yourself and would you kindly keep fighting the good fight.